In the mid-1800s, the US Navy didn't possess any major ships of the line in active service. They did have a few third rates and a single first rate that had been built earlier in the century, but they were either in reserve or in use as accommodation ships and other stationary uses. Thus, the fleet, such as it was, consisted of a mixture of frigates and sloops. But this did not mean the US Navy was ignoring advances in technology. A few steamships had been built in the 1830s and the 1840s, and then in the 1850s, a fairly reasonable order of steam frigates and sloops was placed over a number of years, as the US Navy was now confident of steam's role in naval affairs. Prominent among these orders would be the Hartford class of sloops of war. This would consist of 5 ships, but it wasn't a homogeneous class as we would understand the term today. As originally planned, the general idea was to build a series of steam sloops to match foreign corvettes like the British Cadmus and Pearl classes. But with a wide variety of capabilities, armaments, drafts, displacements, and overall size, the 5 ships were only really loosely connected. The notional class lead, USS Hartford, at 225 foot long and 2,550 tons displacement, was actually the smallest of the lot, but was still rated as a first-class sloop when she was laid down at the start of 1858. She was launched in November of the same year and commissioned in May 1859. Following practice established by the old 6 frigates, she had a white oak keel and live oak framing, although in a new feature, the space between the frames was then filled in solid with more live oak to the bilge level, and iron cross-strapping provided still further hull strength. Her lines were described as very sharp, almost resembling a T-clipper, and this sent her through the water at almost 14 knots, under a combination of 19,000 square feet of primary sails, 18,000 square feet of secondary sails, and a 14.5-foot wide 2-bladed hoisting propeller, which was driven by 2 boilers trunked into a single telescoping funnel. Although her speed under a single power source in normal conditions was more like 9 knots. Initially, her armament consisted of 20 9-inch Dahlgren guns, 10 per side, on a single gun deck, and she was dispatched to the Western Pacific and Indian Oceans to relieve the older paddle frigate USS Mississippi. However, barely had she arrived when the US Civil War broke out back home and she was summoned back, arriving at the end of 1861 for a quick refit, which included the addition of 2 20-pounder and 1 30-pounder rifled guns placed on the upper decks. Now the flagship of Admiral Farragut, she was assigned to lead the West Gulf Blockading Squadron. Hartford therefore led the seaward assault up the Mississippi River. Despite attacks from the ironclad Manassas and a barge which had been turned into a fireship, Hartford survived, although she did ground trying to avoid the fireship, was hit by it, and then caught fire, but her crew proved up to the task of pushing the barge clear and putting out the fires before they reached anything particularly explosive. As the fleet fought its way up past Confederate forts and gun batteries, the Hartford saw action at the Battle of New Orleans and the Siege of Vicksburg, after which she was refitted again and had a couple of 9-inch Dahlgrens replaced by 100-pound rifled guns, and a rather dangerous-looking sawtooth rope cutter was added to her bow in anticipation of cables and other things placed as defences in her next campaign. And so she was back in action in 1864 at the Battle of Mobile Bay, but this would to be her last major engagement, and she in fact spent the last few months of the American Civil War being repaired. Post-war, her armament was reduced to just 16 9-inch guns, along with a single 8-inch rifled gun on a pivoted sliding mount, which could then fire from either side. She spent the next decade alternately cruising the Western Pacific and resting in the reserves, bouncing between these roles a few times. She was also given a full spar deck at some point in the mid-1870s, and was then reassigned to duties on the US coasts. In the 1880s, significant changes were undertaken. Her old machinery was replaced with new compound engines, and it was even proposed that she should be given a ram bow, although that latter didn't eventually happen. After one last Pacific cruise, she was decommissioned in 1887 for use as a training and reserve vessel, and while in reserve, she was given further upgrades. By the late 1880s, she'd had powered ventilation, electric lights, bilge keels, powered steering, and the replacement of her armament with 13 5-inch quick-firing guns all put in place. In 1899, she was recommissioned once more as a training ship, a role in which she would serve until 1912, when she was moved to Charleston, South Carolina, for use as a station ship. She was then decommissioned from this role, and for the last time in 1926, and left in place until 1938 because they didn't know what to do with her. Then she was moved to Washington, D.C. in preparation for making her part of a naval museum. But that idea died with President Roosevelt, and at the end of World War II she was moved once again to Norfolk, Virginia, and left there as, once again, no one had much idea what to do with her. Ideas were put forward to restore her, but no money was forthcoming, and she gradually rotted away before sinking at her berth in 1956, after which it was determined that the hull was now beyond saving, and she was broken up. Although a number of relics were salvaged, and these survive in various museums and other locations to this day.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.